Excellence for the Science of Happiness was begun in IIT Kharagpur, realizing that happy engineers can change the world for better. The idea of Alumina Dr. Aneel was born. Presently, 10 courses are offered, some of which are Science of Happiness and Wellbeing, Happiness at Workplace, Measurement of Happiness, Sports and Wellbeing, Communication and Happiness, Ecological Wellness, Consumer Happiness, and others. The vision is to develop the center as a platform to nurture the science and practice of happiness through scientific perspective across research, academic programs, practice, and outreach. Researches are targeted in science and happiness, well-being of communities, organizations, individuals, various human species, technology, and practice. The mission is to facilitate a transformative journey beyond peace of mind, to be aware, wise, and create a deep and meaningful relationship with self and others. There are 10 projects including behaviometry, happiness in schools, wellness, B2B global partnership, and others. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, Aneel.
Oh, how are you? Wonderful to see you.
Fine.
Wonderful
Nice
to see you. Wonderful to see you. Dr. Reiki, how have you been?
Thank you. Good. How is the situation in the United States?
At the moment, things are well. The sky is clear. The fires are not burning nearby, which is nice, and we can go outside without too much fear of smoke. So I think that's a good thing right now in California. This is a blessing. So thank you for asking.
Wonderful. Go ahead, Pio, you wanted to talk.
No, absolutely not. I just thought that, yes, we could introduce the speaker to our audience, and then we could invite him for his talk. So we welcome you, Professor Chima, to our Center of Excellence for the Science of Happiness. And we are really extremely privileged to have you here with us. And it is my proud privilege to introduce you to all our listeners and guests. Professor Aneel Chima is Director of the Division of Health and Human Performance of the Stanford Flourishing Project. His teaching and research aims to explore the question, answer the questions, what does it mean to flourish as human beings in an age of hyper-complexity? And what is the future of human flourishing as cultural and life rhythms increasingly accelerate? He is co-founder and managing partner of At the Core, a consulting boutique specializing in facilitating transformative change through enhancing the emotional, social, and neurophysiological drivers of team and leadership thriving. So we have with us somebody who is going to talk about rhythms, but from the perspective of accelerating rhythms and the way human beings cope with that fits into our future conference on rhythms as well. That's very fascinating to know that you are working in this area. We would really love to learn and have insights about that from you. And of course, I'm sure that your talk would be very beneficial for many of the students who are interested in leadership and corporate areas. So over to you, Professor Chima, to take this talk forward. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. First of all, I want to thank the entire Reiki Center and everyone associated with it. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Reiki, Professor Samdu, and all of the wonderful faculty and students here. It's my privilege and pleasure to be speaking with you today. And with that, I want to be able to share ideas and also share conversation. So I will frame out some ideas from my point of view on, I think, some relevant topics. And then I would love to open this to a robust conversation with a nice Q&A where everyone can participate and we can discuss these topics with more depth and vigor. So with that, I've presented, or I will be presenting a bit of a slide deck here to accompany my talk. So give me one moment to share that. Okay. So I want to start with asking a question. And that question is as follows. What is the future of resilience and flourishing? And I ask that because I think given what's occurring in our emerging present and in our emerging future, particularly the fact that we see the pace of change shifting fundamentally, we have to have a future orientation always. Otherwise, if we don't, we will miss the trends that are coming upon us at unprecedented speed. And so the first thing I want to mention is that it's no longer the case that we can only think about the past and the present. I think we have to learn from the past, embed ourselves in the present, and look towards the future and have this sort of trinocular vision always. And so I want to say a few pieces here about what kind of trends are defining our current age and why these trends matter fundamentally to these questions of resilience, flourishing, happiness, and how to live a good and fulfilling life. And so if we sense into the experiences that we've been having in this current reality, and also including the tragedy of the pandemic due to COVID-19, it's clear that change, and change of a certain sort, which my collaborators and I call 3D change, defines our everyday experience. And so when we talk about happiness, resilience, flourishing, what is the future of this in the context of 3D change? Change that is perpetual. It is unrelenting and ongoing. Think of the fact that black swans are the norm. Disruption is the ongoing reality, and it will not let up. Second, in addition to change being perpetual, it's pervasive. It's in multiple domains of life at once. It's in how we educate, how we work. It's in healthcare. It's in all of these fundamental areas of life simultaneously. And then third, it's exponential. That pace of change is increasing at an increasing rate. And so this idea that culture is accelerating, that tech is accelerating exponentially, that human genetic pace of change even is accelerating, that it's happening ongoing and in all these domains at once, I think is one megatrend that defines our current reality and our emerging future. The second is that humans and technology are converging. Right? Convergence, and I often offer convergence in contrast to the singularity paradigm, which I think is perhaps too strongly pitching humans versus machines. But I think our current moment and our emerging future is defined also by this second megatrend of convergence. So not only do you have the convergence of complex technologies into more and more consolidated technologies. Think of the iPhone, for example, and all the things that it can do simultaneously. But you're also talking about the convergence of technology and humans, such that they've become interdependent and interrelated. And in fact, technology more and more is mediating our cognition, how we think, feel, perceive, and sense make. And technology is ubiquitous everywhere. In fact, here we are right now, this moment, in a mediated experience. And let me drive home the point with a very, very simple example. I often ask my students, I have them raise their hand if any of them can name the phone number of their 10 closest family and friends. And I see 0 hands up, 0. And so I say, okay, how about 5? Your closest 5 family and friends, and maybe a few hands go up. Well, I remember when I was growing up, I had everyone's phone number memorized, particularly my family and friends. But something has shifted, right? Because now we store them all in our smartphones and we call them up at the touch of a screen and we can contact anyone. Well, something has shifted about how we cognize, how we think, and this is very much dependent on this human technology convergence. I think GPS is another excellent example. We've in fact degraded our ability to sort of navigate the world and understand how to get from point A to B to C to D. And we have sort of outsourced it to our GPS. So the contours of technology, and this is very, very, very rudimentary, have actually changed how we think, how it nudges how we feel. We also see this in profoundly in the cohort of 25 and under, where exponential increases in depression and anxiety, loneliness are occurring. In fact, this convergence has changed how an entire generation connects with each other and themselves, and not always for the better, and in some cases profoundly challenging ways. This is a stat here from the US. We know that worldwide, by the end of this year, well over 5 billion people will have cell phones, and that here in the US, Americans spend 9 hours on screens a day. Think about that. 9 hours across all these screens. Does that have an implication for your happiness, for how you flourish? Yes, it must. And that's a profound implication. And then the third piece that I want to point out is that in the midst of 3D change and convergence, we must really understand how to navigate a world where information saturates us. 90% of the data in the world today was created in the last 2 years. 90%. What effect does this have on our cognition, right? Again, in this case, I define cognition simply as how we think, feel, perceive, and sense make. In a world where information saturates us, it's becoming ever more difficult to capture the signal amidst all the noise of our lives. And so I think another trend that we're going to need to look to in this paradigm of 3D change and convergence is using the 3 C's of computation, collaboration, and communication to enhance our cognition, to even have the chance to navigate this convergent and 3-dimensional change reality that we're in. So I want to start with a question that I think helps us reclaim a bit of our humanity in the midst of these megatrends. And that is why. The question, why? And I offer this because I believe that this question of why, which I think is one of the defining characteristics of being human, the ability to ask and answer, why does this matter? Why does this mean something to me? Why am I doing this? This metacognitive question, which has 2 sides to the same coin. And in fact, I think helps us define at a base level 2 fundamental impulses of being human. And those are, 1, that we are storytellers. That we tell stories to ourselves and to each other about ourselves and about each other and about the world. And meaning making is transacted through the medium of story. And so I quote here the Harvard psychologist Robert Kegan, human being is meaning making. For the human, what evolving amounts to is the evolving of systems of meaning. The business of organisms is to organize. In this sense, we think of meaning making as a constructivist activity. We construct meaning and we instantiate it in story. And then I would say the other sort of core impulse is that of the builder and the maker. And this is where I think the other side of the coin of purpose, and I'll quote Bill Damon, my esteemed colleague at Stanford, who runs the Center for Adolescent Studies and is one of the world's leading purpose scholars. The purpose is an ultimate concern. It's the final answer to the question, why? Why are you doing this? Why does it matter to you? Why is it important? A purpose is a deeper reason for the immediate goals and motives that drive most daily behavior. It's, in other words, an enactivism point of view, or an enactivist perspective, where we define purpose as having three components, which I'll come back to a little later, but I want to mention them. So purpose subsumes the storytelling impulse, and then also has this element that spills out into the world as behaviors. So Damon talks about purpose as having three components. One, that it is a stable intention to accomplish something. That is, two, personally meaningful, and three, serves the world beyond the self. And so I talk about this question of why as an entryway into reclaiming our sort of pathway to flourishing, because meaning and purpose, storytelling and building, unify the inner worlds of our experiences of cognition and the outer worlds of our doing and behaviors in the world. And I think it's this special unification of the inner and the outer on this axis of meaning and purpose in the midst of this world that is so information saturated, that is so dynamically changing in 3D change, that is alien in how the convergence of human and technology is has implications on our day-to-day life, that this question of why, and getting back to our storytelling and our making and building, is so essential. So I want to pivot here for a moment and talk about what is this self that is experiencing 3D change, convergence, information saturation. And I'd like to reimagine what we think of as a self. And so I want to discuss that this idea that the self is, in fact, a mind-brain-body system in relationship with itself, that we are a system of systems internally, and further, that we, as a mind-brain-body system in relationship with all the systems within us, we are also in relationship with all the systems outside of us, technological systems, social systems, cultural systems, ecological systems. And if we were to visualize it, we could think of the self as a permeable system of systems internally that is embedded in these social, cultural, ecological, technological, or the technium, the world of technology systems. And that the mediating component is the mind. And so I'll define the mind in this context, and I will use the definition from interpersonal neurobiology, a subfield originated by Dr. Dan Siegel and Alan Shore down at UCLA, which I find highly compelling. That this self, this internal system of systems, the brain, mind-brain-body system embedded in these external social, cultural, ecological, and technological systems, that it's made sense of through this mind. Basically, the flashlight of awareness that I can shine out there or in here, inside. and that this mind is a regulatory process that regulates the flow of energy and information. So right now, energy in the form of compression waves are going into the microphone here and out of the speakers wherever you are, compression waves causing the vibration of my eardrums. And because we have a shared language, not only is that energy vibrating my eardrum and causing electrochemical cascades across my brain, it also is encoded in information. And so this flow of energy and information is patterned, and brain states and body states in you are awakening and enlivening based off of what I'm saying and what's alive in mine. And so our brain start communicating via this sort of flow of energy and information. And so the regulatory process of the mind is what I'm discussing here, and that it regulates this flow of energy and information by what we attend to. And so if we think about that in the context of this world of 3D change, of convergence, of information saturation, our mind is being taxed in ways that it never had evolved for, and never has been in the history of humans being on Earth. So I'm going to return to that a little bit later. I think it's essential. Now, let's go back to that initial question. What's the future of resilience and flourishing? Well, in order to look into the future of it, we should think a bit about what it is, in fact, now. And so most simply, you can think of resilience as going from a baseline equilibrium state to a deficit state, and then the ability to bounce back neurophysiologically back to equilibrium, and that ability to bounce back quicker, more fully, more robustly, this is resilience. Whereas flourishing is going from that baseline, but raising the ceiling of the baseline so that we have a higher ceiling of well-being and flourishing, or a greater capacity to experience. And so let's go a little bit further into what are those domains? What might a model of it look like? Well, I'm swayed here by this mantra, let's call it. Here, as mentioned, that the absence of illness does not equal the presence of health. And I'm trained as a psychologist, and I can say that, traditionally the entire field of psychology was really predicated on an x-axis, a horizontal axis of going from mental illness to low mental illness. And I think this is very important. But the absence of illness does not equal the presence of health. Then even if we work on this axis of mental illness to no mental illness, or illness to no illness in general, we are missing half the picture. Vertical continuum from languishing to flourishing, from low mental health. And this is really important because if you look at this so-called two continuum model, the x-axis going from high mental health to low mental health, the y-axis going from languishing at the bottom to flourishing at the top. If you look at, for example, where I am in the U.S., the largest segment of the U.S. adult population is in that lower right. Low mental illness or no mental illness, and yet languishing. And now, pre-pandemic, it was about 35 to 40%. It's even higher now. So think about that. Most U.S. adults, and I don't have the global data because I don't think the research has been done, but I surmise that it might trend similarly. Most U.S. adults are languishing, and the largest segment are languishing without mental illness. So again, the absence of illness does not necessarily equal the presence of health. Instead, we must embrace flourishing as an intentioned act and work on this vertical axis if we are to generate a more resilient and flourishing and well society that has happiness and joy and goodness and all the ways we want to experience in the human experience. And so let's define some domains of flourishing. We use a 4-factor model plus a fifth of physical, but emotional in our case, and I love this image, emotional well-being or flourishing is the ability to generate and savor positive emotion, happiness, joy, satisfaction. The second domain being psychological difference, that I accept myself, that I have the ability to contribute. Social, loving relationships on the one hand, and on the other, the communal piece, that I have a fuel ourselves with nutrition and how we exercise and move our bodies. If these are the domains of flourishing, what's the future of flourishing? For you, for your relationships, for your communities, in a world where these megatrends are defining the emerging future. How do we ignite this future of flourishing? How do we scale it with authenticity and depth? And how do we sustain movements around it? So I think this is a fundamental question this lecture series is asking. And so I want to just name a couple of paradoxes here. One is that we are seeking to disrupt and yet maintain. This disruption paradox is that our systems of deepest meaning-making must be reimagined while retaining their essences in an emerging future that may be radically different. I happen to be a Buddhist, and so I used an image of the Buddha here. I think this is a compelling image. You know, I have a deep interest in preserving ancient wisdom in contemporary contexts and or applying ancient wisdom in contemporary contexts. And yet, the skillful means of, for example, the contemplative traditions of Buddhism or of Hinduism or of my father's lineage of Sikhism or of any of the great world religions or philosophies or so on. We are in a world where I think we must retain their essence, or any system whereby we make deepest meaning, we must maintain their essences while bringing them into a form that is resonant with this radically different emerging reality. So this disruption paradox is one paradox I think we must wrestle with. And within this, I think it's important to acknowledge that this idea of the art and science of well-being, or even the art and science of sort of contemplation, are important and essential, but wholly insufficient to emerge these new systems of meaning-making and well-being. We must, in fact, add the catalyst of social innovation. So if we are to scale in flourishing individually and collectively, then we need the art and science of well-being. We need this contemplative capacity to enhance our attention, awareness, deep reflection, and transcendence. But we really also need this catalytic force of social innovation, leadership studies, and entrepreneurial ethos, leveraging transformative technology, thinking in systems. This is what's necessary, and only at the convergence of all three of these will we see scalable flourishing for individuals and the collective. And we need to look at this in what I call the rule of 1, 2, 3 plus. 1 being the individual, the unit of analysis of the individual. 2, the unit of analysis of the relational between me and you or me and other people. And 3 plus, the unit of analysis of the micro community or group or team. And so how do we emerge these new systems? I really believe that we have to be willing to prototype and test. We all have to be designers. This is the 5-step design thinking protocol from our colleagues at the Stanford D School. How can we go beyond our usual assumptions and methods and pioneer new ones? Well, I think we have to empathize. We have to understand more deeply what's the need set of the people who are living in this emerging reality. We need to define well the sets of challenges that we face and the problems we want to solve. And then we have to ideate in a very generative and creative and innovative fashion, and then converge on some prototypes and learn by doing, testing, and then iterating this whole cycle over and over again as we refine. And then I want to point out what I think is the second paradox here, what I call the transformation paradox. We need leaders and change makers envisioning and creating transformative processes for human connection and flourishing from a transformed place beyond current mindsets and paradigms. So how do we bootstrap our way up into a greater and more transformed mindset and paradigm while having to start or springboard from the paradigm we are in currently? And I often like to quote Einstein's famous quotation here. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. Or, as I might reword it, re-articulated for our times, we can't overcome challenges, inner and outer, by using the same level of consciousness we used when we created them. We must up-level. We must transform our own minds and mindsets and our paradigms and horizons of possibilities so that we have the kind of consciousness that allows us to see a new horizon of possibility that bootstraps us out of our current reality and into the emerging reality we need that allows for flourishing for all. And so I'll simply pause here and say, we're going to turn to more of a Q&A, but if you would like to follow up this conversation via email, here's my email address. And with that, I'd like to invite everyone to sort of jot down any thoughts or questions or comments that you have, and we're going to open this to a broader conversation here. So, okay. So Professor Samdu, perhaps, or Dr. Reiki, you all are more skilled at facilitating these talks than I and how they flow, but there's the sort of target micro talk here, and now we'll open it for a broader conversation.
I can do that by asking you a question.
Thank you, sir.
May I, Priyo?
Please.
Anil, I think that was an excellent presentation. You're a very deep presenter, deep thoughts, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.
You touched upon various issues, the vertical axis going from languishing to flourishing, and I like the two axes that you've made between illness and mental health. All of that is wonderful. You use terms of transcendence and consciousness and awe and wonder too. What was missing, or maybe I missed it, was spirituality. Would future flourishing need some amount of spirituality? Whatever that means to anybody, it's a deeper connection or knowledge of the consciousness. As you said, we have to raise the consciousness. So that was not mentioned, and I just thought I'll ask you.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, Dr. Reiki. I would say what I mean by spirituality is contemplative. I tend to use the term contemplative simply because in English, and then if I look at spirituality with its Latin root, it has spirito, it has certain implications. So in that regard, I choose contemplative, but it's sort of in a lay term, you could equally substitute spirituality. And for many of us, spirituality and systems of spirituality are the places where we have our systems of deepest meaning making. And so this sort of like paradox, this disruption paradox and transformation paradox, I think spirituality is essential. And in fact, one of my colleagues, the dean of the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life at Stanford, often talks about this spiritual well-being, and I think it's a great term. I just happen to tend to use the word contemplative, but I think they capture this a very similar space, which is the fundamental sort of capacity to attend to one thing. Attention, sustained attention in a noisy world is essential. That second piece of awareness, inner and outer awareness, and perhaps even awareness of transcendent experiences. Third, this deep sort of like reflective quality that we ponder. And many of us have lost or compromised our reflective ability. And then I think, to your point, this transcendence, which is often found in awe and wonder experiences. And so all of these, I would say, describe key domains of the contemplative or the spiritual. And so I'm with you. I think this is essential.
And Anil, you said your father was a Sikh, and probably you are also.
Yes, I am too, yes.
The word Vahaguru is also one of awe.
Yes, absolutely. I think this exclamation is a beautiful call into the wonderment and awe of the moment and of the transcendent. And in fact, Dr. Reiki, what I would say is I really like, I'm very swayed by the research of some of my colleagues at Berkeley, Dr. Decker Keltner and others, and then folks in the business school at the University of Toronto, where they found in the research that if you give people an experience of awe, they will be more pro-social, more altruistic in their behaviors, as measured by, for example, behavioral economics games or game scenarios. And so I think this idea of recapturing this awe, and can we engineer awe? Can we create experiences and design for experiences of awe? I think the extent to which we can do this actually is the extent to which we can save humanity, because it actually helps us open to pro-social altruistic behaviors in ways that other modalities don't quite do. So, beautifully said.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you.
Yeah.
May I?
Yes, Jagdish ji. Is that
Hi. Yes, that's me. Thank you.
We have, just to announce, we have people from the far east of the world, from Hong Kong. We see Richard Sir there, and Anil is from California. So we are on two extremes of the world, but we are all in between. Thank you for joining. Yes, Jagdish, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted a small comment, and maybe our guest for the evening could respond. And since Dr. Reiki also mentioned Sikh, and I tell myself sometimes things are not as complex as they seem. If only we have the time to see the simplicity in which we can understand them. And what came to my mind immediately as this conversation was going on, and I dare share it with everybody, simple lines from the Eko Onkar, which I have heard of so much. I'm not a Sikh, but I've spent many years to a temple doing seva, and it says, there's a lovely line that says, you can be very, very clever, but nothing is going to work in the end. And this, I sometimes tell myself, and I wonder how others react to this, that we actually think we are wise, but we are only clever. And the cleverer we get, the more we are withdrawn from the wisdom that we seek. And that's the source of a lot of trouble. I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jagdish ji. I hope you're not expecting an answer for that. I suppose that's a statement from you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. So the floor is open for questions, and also please pick up from the YouTubers if there's any question. I see something coming in. That's a very long one. I don't know. Anyway.
I'm happy to engage with it, Professor
So
Samdu.
let me read it out.
Yeah.
As you mentioned about consciousness and our mind, mental state is connected with our consciousness and the subconscious mind, which is not under our control, but can be controlled by practices of mindfulness and meditation. But often our subconscious trends to affect our lives in many ways since we do not have a direct control over it. What is your view on this? As nature demands, such are we to leave our subconscious as it is, or are we to control?
No. Well, I think this is a deep question, very deep question. And I would say, let me start by taking it on in a few different ways. One, I think Freud got many things wrong, but one thing Freud got right was that there's an unconscious, and that these unconscious processes are profoundly shaping of our day-to-day behaviors and experiences. Now, it's quite obvious in the current paradigm of cognitive neuroscience that most cognitive processing that is going on every moment is going on unconsciously, right? And that you could look at it and analyze it from a variety of points of view, but you could say that we have multiple schemas, for example, that are at play about any given domain, and that schema is like an iceberg, and we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg with the vast majority of the iceberg under the surface of the water, or so-called in our unconscious. And so I might say that one of the core purposes, for example, of psychotherapy, to return to Freud in a way, was to bring what was unconscious and make it conscious, or at least try to increasingly make conscious things that are unconscious. I would say, for example, meditation is another example of this. We are trying to bring into consciousness many unconscious patterns. Having said that, depending on the paradigm from which you operate, from a cognitive neuroscience paradigm, I think the idea is that there will always be unconscious processes that are opaque to us, that we cannot see. We can only see to some degree under the water. Other paradigms, for example, perhaps a contemplative paradigm, might say that actually it's the contemplative path that is a purpose of the path to examine that unconscious. In either case, I think in all cases, it is a good to probe deeper into understanding the patterns, either directly or indirectly, that are at play in our unconscious, that in fact unconsciously impact our thinking and behaving on a day-to-day purpose, so that we have a bit more awareness and agency. And the further challenge is, I think, what's hard is in a world of 3D change, in a world of information saturation, instead we're seeing our ability to access many of these unconscious factors becoming increasingly compromised, not increasingly accessible. And so this is part of how do we design technologies, systems, abilities that actually allow us individually and collectively to look at all this material that's driving the behaviors that we see every day. And in many cases, the behaviors that are incredibly maladaptive, antisocial behaviors. And so understanding these drivers of behaviors and thinking patterns that are largely unconscious, I think, is one of the prime challenges of our time.
Thank you, Anil. There's another question. Let me read out. It's from Ankur. He says that previously our life were different. In fact, that virtual self was a kind of a supplementary thing. Now we are heading more and more towards a time where virtual self starts dominating the physical self. And in some cases, it's more preferable and convenient choice is digital detox is the only way to flourish?
This is a powerful question. I recently co-wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review about how to lead in an era of exponential change. And therein, we posited a model, my co-author Ron Gutman and myself posited a model of what we called sapient leadership. Leadership, sapience in this case, has two elements. On the one hand, it has this idea of being wise and sagacious, to the question of wisdom before. And on the other, it has relating to being humane and relating to the human experience. I believe that sapient leaders, and I think change makers in general, have to actually be masters of four dimensions. On the one hand, from the individual to the collective, let's say individual to collective, and then on the other axis, radically tech augmented to radically tech free. So I actually have to master the ability to be flourishing when radically tech augmented and doing that well. And in fact, I think we must design part of how we're trying to raise our consciousness and our horizon possibility is to take on the question, what if we actually designed for technologies that increased human connection, well-being, and flourishing fundamentally as the core design challenge? So what does it look like to create technologies and technological systems like that? And on the other hand, how do we completely go tech-free and from time to time have the experience of what it means to sort of digitally detox, to be without? What is it like? What's the phenomenology of encountering ourselves nakedly without any technology, or at least complex technologies? And so I think doing that, both as individuals and as collectives, give us a more robust sense of what it's like to master and create in our individual and relational experiences radically tech augmented experiences, because I think we can create ones that are positive and reduce the ones that are negative or maladaptive, and also look at the exact opposite. What's it like to be radically tech free? And keep it in mind both, because I do not think we can put the genie back in the bottle. Technology and complex technology is out and will continue to grow and complexify. We have to navigate it well. And a sapient leader is one who it navigates it radically humanly in the face of alien change.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have one more. From the current theory discussed, is resilience a process or moving from languishing to flourishing, or is it resilience a product observed only when one is flourishing?
Mm-hmm.
From Swahasini.
Yeah, it's a great question. I see resilience and flourishing as two sides of the same coin, which is when I go from a neurophysiological equilibrium state to a deficit state and then back to the equilibrium, that's the resilience, right? And when I enhance my baseline and nudge it and increase its ceiling, that's the flourishing. And so I think I might define it more as a state rather than a trait. So if I were to make a very quick model here, I'll borrow from some of my interpersonal neurobiology friends, and I'm going to turn my hand here into a model of the brain. So if I tap my palm, this is the brain stem, heart rate, respiration rate, keep me alive, I don't have to think about it. Fold in my thumb, this is the limbic system, fight or flight, staying alive, fight or flight. Here's my flexible mind, fold it over, that's the cortex, and then the prefrontal cortex. Here's my brain, right, in the palm of my hand. And as Dan Siegel would say, when we perceive threat, we flip our lid. We lose access to the cortical structure and our limbic system hijacks and takes over. In a way, you could say that resilience is the ability to go from from a lid flipped state back to putting our lid back on, bringing our cortex back online. And then flourishing is the ability to activate all of the capacities of the cortex and the prefrontal cortex. This is the so-called triune model of the brain. It's oversimplified, right? But it's useful, the triune model of the brain. So if this going from here to here is limbic system hijack, putting your lid back on is resilience, activating the full capacity of the cognitive simulator called the cortex and the prefrontal cortex to generate and experience positive emotion, to have meaning and purpose, to have social connection, to have contemplative sort of well-being, that to me would be flourishing. So they're complementary, differentiated and complementary and linked processes.
Thank you. I'm aware of the time. We have another 6-7 minutes to go. So we also have somebody from France, Rana, if you have any questions to ask. And Rana works as the dream fulfiller. People have come with a dream and she tries to fulfill those dreams. Any questions from YouTubers? There's no question? All right.
Well, I need a dream fulfiller.
Ask question, you can raise your hands. Oh, there's something that's come now. 2 questions. One person asking 2 questions? Okay, it's probably, is it Prachi? Archie or Diganta? Archie, all right. You ask yourself.
Yeah, so I was looking at the 2D model you were using. So one was in y-axis it was mental health and in x-axis it was mental illness, right? So my curiosity was, can somebody have high mental health and high mental illness at the same time?
This is a great question. Great question. So I do not believe you can flourish and have sort of unmanaged mental illness. But in this 2 continuum model, you can have a diagnosed mental illness and be managing it well and be flourishing. So, for example, and the originator of this framework his name is Dr. Corey Keyes. He's actually quite public about this. And I've heard him say this in several public talks. He himself, he considers as someone who has mental illness and is flourishing. He says he struggles with clinical depression as a diagnosis. It's not something that just disappears, but he also is flourishing. And when he has a depressive episode that occurs, he has a good sort of support system in place. He has good techniques and tools to bring to bear. And so he bounces back better than he used to, or more than, but he is still struggling with a clinical depression, a diagnosis. Now, I would say it's not either or, it's both and. We should definitely be working with the clinical axis and be working with this mental health axis and be working on the sort of mental illness and be working on the mental health and flourishing axis. It's both and. That's the key point. Further, it's interesting. Part of the evolutionary residue is that neutral skews negative. Why? Because we're threat perceiving organisms. We want to flip our lid a lot because this gives us sort of adrenaline, cortisol, cognitive tunnel vision, stay alive, stay alive. The challenge is, who's left? We are, the stressed out freaks. We have a negative cognitive bias. So in order to flourish, neutral skews negative, which means we have to have an intentioned, proactive set of intentions and behaviors to flourish every day, every week. Otherwise, we skew towards negative. And so I think this is kind of in and around your really interesting question.
Thank you. Dr. Sangeeta from England, if you wanted Anil's email, I hope you copied his email. It was at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. If you have anything to ask, please.
Yeah, I actually found. Can you hear me? Is it okay? I'm sorry, I'm on a mobile phone.
Yes, can hear you clearly. Thank you.
Okay, great. I found your whole presentation incredibly interesting. Thank you for it. There is something that I do want to add to this, though, is that there is a real level of disruption energy which is required for transformation and also to fuel change. That's also part of the whole universal construct. So that, for many beings, is sometimes deemed as negative, but it obviously has an incredibly valuable function. So this is something that I think is often kind of ignored or even misunderstood. And I know that in Buddhism, it's kind of it's given, and it's very much given in Judaism. Provocation. It's a provocateur energy or paradigm.
Sure.
So I just wanted to bring that into the construct as well.
Absolutely. I live in Silicon Valley. Disruption is almost like a fetish for disruption, right? Disrupt. And I think disruption is neither good nor bad. Disruption is. Buddhist wisdom, the fundamental truth is that all things are impermanent. In other words, you could say that all things will be disrupted on some level. And the question is the disruption harnessed for something generative, or does the disruption lead to sort of extinction of a sort of an individual or of a species? And so I think disruption is one of the ultimate double-edged swords. And so your point is well taken. What I will
Aneel,
say,
that's only if you actually believe that there is anything that is not generative.
Well, I think there are things that lead to death. And so in my sense of definition, where something dies, that's probably, for that being, probably anti-generative, but perhaps for the species generative. So I would say death is an anti-generative state for an individual. And so that's my stake in the ground, is that, the end of life is an anti-generative state for individuals who would like to live. But, I take your point. But I do think there are certain things that are quote unquote anti-generative.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. A longer conversation, certainly.
Yes, I've actually just contacted you on LinkedIn. I'm sorry I didn't catch your email.
Thank you, Dr. Sangeeta. Thank you so much. This will be the last question, and this is from really far east, another extreme, very late. He's been attending our course. Oh, there he is, Richard, sir. If you want to directly ask, or do you want me to read your question out? Maybe you ask.
Professor Samdu, you have a better voice.
No, it's not true. But his question is beautiful. So he says, Mr. Chima, a question. Can we please hear from you about happiness, not of self, but of a place, a city, a community, a cause? If we work on that, does it bring happiness to inner self? Is that enough? Is his question.
Let me see if I understand the question more deeply. I think there are some nuances there that I want to understand first before taking it on. Is it that happiness is actually held in these entities of a place, a city, a community, and a cause, and that the happiness there is partaken by itself, and then it then in turn influences the self? Or is it that, like, is happiness seen as almost an entity unto itself that is partaken by selves? Or me understand a little bit more about what you're asked, because I want to really understand it as best I can.
Thank you, Aneel. I think maybe I'm looking at the Chinese perspective.
Please.
Very often we don't think about working for happiness, building our own happiness.
Oh, yeah.
And some people would say to serve.
Yes.
To serve actually builds a certain satisfaction.
Yes.
But I think if we are finding ways to create happiness for a city, for a community, for a cause, does that? I mean, hopefully my way of thinking is that could be enough, because it's something bigger than yourself.
Oh, okay, I think I understand your question better. That's a really interesting question. So I think, one, I would differentiate what often is termed in the positive psychology literature between sort of hedonic happiness and eudaimonic happiness, right, as Aristotle and the Greeks would talk about. And so the hedonic treadmill is that the infinite race to sort of chase these hedonic, pleasurable states. And so this is certainly a transient piece. Having said that, Keyes believes that positive emotion, some amount of hedonic happiness, is important. And that comes from, going directly to a state. Like sometimes I can have a hedonic experience by eating delicious chocolate, right? I get this dopamine hit or something like that. But this is a very kind of happiness of flux, whereas eudaimonic is that more stable byproduct that emerges because of the types of activities that you talk about. And so deep happiness, or let's say flourishing, a mental flourishing, I would be very sympathetic to the point of view that you mentioned, which is that it's an emergent property. It's an emergent property in and around a life well lived, that a life well lived is instantiated by these types of behaviors and mindsets. And that is inclusive of ones that are pro-social beyond the self, that are relational and communal. And so from those elements of a life well lived, you have the emergence of the eudaimonic well-being and happiness. And so I think that's resonant with what you're saying. And I would be highly sympathetic to that view.
Thank you. I think we come to the end of the evening. Dr. Ricky, would you like to say a few words, or shall I conclude?
I would, but I think I'll let Rio say a few words, and after that.
Thank you very much, Anilji. It was absolutely spellbinding. It was really an honor to listen to it, and I'm sure that many of our scholars have benefited from this wonderful talk. Most important, it has set them thinking about some very, very important concepts in our lives. I have questions, but or rather things for discussion, but probably I will write to you separately, because I find that something which Alvin Toffler took up at a particular point of time, talking about change and rapid change and accelerating change, also happens in some way to be the theme of your work. And there are fundamental questions which relate to, I would say, traditional wisdom, which talks about flourishing, and the way these challenge some of this traditional wisdom. So it could be a very interesting way of looking at these things at a later point of time. So maybe I'll write to you personally. But thank you very much, sir, for a very enlightening talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Aneel. It was really wonderful listening to you, and I've heard some of your videos, but you're definitely much better in person, and I hope we can see you face to face. And we would like to, I'm sure Priyo and Samdu and others would like to invite you personally to IIT Kharagpur, and then all of our students and scholars can have a face-to-face chat. Overall, it was a wonderful experience, and I thank you.
Oh, it would be my joy and pleasure. And in fact, I'm also in a conversation. Do you know Rahul Mehta, Dr. Reiki?
That's a familiar name, but you have to give me a little more.
Well, but let's extend this conversation. I'm inspired by what you have set up here with the center, the Reiki Center, and I love to continue to connect these various centers of excellence that are looking at these questions around the world. And so let's continue the conversation. It would be my honor to come in person and also to invite the Reiki Center into some of the networks that we are co-convening. I think the networks would be richer for your center's participation. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you,
Are you referring to Uday Mehta?
Rahul Mehta.
Rahul Mehta. All right, listeners out there, you have heard our dear speaker of the day. Although it's evening here, but it's very early morning for him. We woke him up. We are helping him change his biological time now. Thank you, Anil. Thank you so much for giving us this wonderful talk. I know all our research scholars have really benefited. It has been one of the most flourishing talks, I would say. And thank you for waking so early in the morning. And we would like to further request you, we have sent a mail and you have accepted to come in December or give online the talk on rhythms of happiness. So for that, you will also receive official letter from Professor Patnaik, our head. And thank you so much, Richard sir, so far onto the east that you still wake up so late in the night to honor us. Thank you, Sangeeta. Thank you, Rana. Thank you, Dr. Ruchira. Thank you, all of you. I can't, spell each name out, but without you coming to attend this, it would not have been successful. And thank you, Reiki sir. Thank you so much for your presence. That gives us so much of energy to do more in our lives. And thank you, Professor Jagdish, for all your greatness. And we will see that in early next year, you will be one of our speakers as well. So please keep that in mind. Thank you so much. And he had a question, but sorry, it's too late now. We'll have to close this. Maybe you can write to him. Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, Anil. And good night to others who are in the evening. And good day to the mid-world, England and France and other places. And good morning to the US colleagues. And good night to the East. Thank you, Richard sir, for being there for us as well.